Deep Water by Watt Key. Chapter 1. The GPS beeped, signaling our arrival at the dive site. Dad slowed our old 29-foot trawler, the Barbie doll, and I sat up and peered through the windows of the wheelhouse. We'd lost sight of land over an hour ago, nearly 90 miles off the coast of Gulf Shores, Alabama. There was nothing to see above the waterline except for an endless expanse of swells shimmering in the sunlight. But off our port side I saw a swarm of fish descending in a column through the jade-colored water. "You're right," I said to him. "There's fish all over it." Somewhere in the depths below were 2 Army tanks, government surplus from the Vietnam War. 3 years before, my dad, Gibson Sims, had been hired to tow them out on a barge and push them into the water. They were sank to the seafloor to create an artificial fish habitat. Then, through an unfortunate occurrence that had nothing to do with him, the coordinates were lost and the tanks presumably abandoned forever beneath over 100 feet of water. It wasn't until a week ago that Dad found the tanks again. He said they'd attracted barnacles and tiny fish, which in turn attracted larger fish, until the tanks were a fully developed reef. Now the reef was home to hundreds of varieties of fish and resembled an amusement park for sea creatures. I was eager to see the reef, but most important to me that day was knowing these tanks could save Dad's charter business. We needed to make sure our clients, Hank Gordon and his son Shane, had a good dive and told others about it. "Yep," Dad said under his breath. "They'll get their money's worth." I sensed he was nervous, too. He knew as well as I did how important this dive was. I looked at him. He was barefoot in his swim trunks and a faded Madras plaid shirt. His wild gray hair seemed permanently stiff with dried salty water. His face was a little sunburned, but he was still fresh and youthful looking, like a boy trapped in a middle-aged body. He was a big bear of a man, but he often reminded me of an overgrown kid, and despite the family and financial problems we'd left ashore, I felt proud of him for the first time in a long while. Just the anticipation of a scuba dive can melt your worries away, and once you descend into the blue-green depths, it seems the rest of the world doesn't even exist. I feel like an astronaut drifting in silent, immense space. Only this space is not dark and empty, but full of colorful sea life. Nothing compares to the thrill and peacefulness of hanging weightlessly in this mysterious world of exotic creatures. Dad glanced behind us, making sure our clients were still seated on the back deck. The location of the tanks was a valuable secret, and he didn't trust them to keep their eyes off our navigation equipment. Those 2 were about as difficult as they come. Both Mr. Jordan and Shane spoke to us rudely, didn't listen to advice, and were always arguing with each other. Dad was still stewing over Mr. Jordan insulting his charter operation that morning and looking down on me like a 12-year-old girl had no place on the boat. Normally, he would have told them to take their business elsewhere, but today they were paying nearly 4 times our usual rate, and we needed the money. "I don't think they can see the GPS from back there," I assured him. Dad frowned doubtfully and wiped his forehead again with a hand towel. "How do you feel?" I asked. On the way out, I noticed him sweating and wiping his face. I guessed it was his diabetes and got him a candy bar, but he didn't seem any better. "Dad?" I said again. He didn't like talking about his health and didn't seem concerned about it either. I felt like I was constantly having to monitor him. I recalled a dive the summer before when we'd had to surface early because his blood sugar was low and he got disoriented at 50 feet. It was episodes like that which worried me. Dad, are you able to go down or not? It was over 100 feet to the seafloor, and I wasn't a certified dive master like he was. I'd certainly been that deep many times before, but it wouldn't look very professional to the Jordans if I replaced Dad as their guide. But if something were to happen to Dad at those depths, people like the Jordans couldn't be relied on to help him. Mr. Jordan won't like me guiding them, I said. I'm not worried about what that jerk likes and doesn't like, Dad replied. Those two are reckless enough to get themselves in trouble down there, and I don't want you mixed up in it. I can handle myself, I said. I know, but I can still be worried about it. Dad's the toughest person I know. I once saw him stitch a cut on his leg with a fish hook and fishing line so he wouldn't have to end a dive trip early. I knew if he decided to send me in his place, he would have to be feeling really bad. But one of the most important rules of diving is if you don't feel right, don't go down. There are already too many things that can go wrong with a person's body in the depths without adding other complications. I exited the wheelhouse to find the Jordans arguing about their spear guns and who got to take the larger one. Shane was about my age. He and I had been in the same class at elementary school when I lived with my parents in Gulf Shores. That was before Mom and Dad divorced, and I moved to Atlanta with Mom, leaving Dad behind in our old house. Now Shane was taller than I remembered, and he'd grown his hair out so that it hung almost to his shoulders in a style popular with local surfers. He wore a Salt Life t-shirt, Aptco shorts, and deck sandals, all of it looking like he'd pulled the price tags off that morning. He's smart, athletic, wealthy, and good-looking if you like the type. I don't like the type. Even when we were younger, he struck me as one of those kids who complain about everything, like they're in a constant battle with an unfair world, when I can't imagine they know anything about unfair. Shane's father was a local attorney, but his face was on interstate billboards clear to Montgomery. On the advertisements, Hank Jordan looked tall and thin in a trim, expensive pinstripe suit. He held a stern expression and had his arms crossed over his chest, like he'd just solved a big problem. What I saw standing before me in a fishing shirt, shorts, and Crocs was a shorter, wrinkled version of the man on the signs. He looked a lot more like an aging weasel. "This it?" Mr. Jordan asked. "Yes," I replied as I made my way up to the bow. "We're at the Malzone tanks." That's what Dad and I called them, after the guy who hired us to put them in the water. I unfastened the anchor chain and held it while Dad maneuvered the Barbie doll, taking it in and out of gear and assessing the current. Finally, I heard him tap on the window glass. I let the chain slip from my hands and heard the anchor plunge into the water. For scuba divers, this basic piece of boating equipment is much more than something to keep us moored in place. It's our guide to the seafloor and our lifeline back to the boat. I leaned over the railing and watched the white rope stream into the depths. The visibility was decent, but the current was strong up top. I hoped it wasn't as swift down below. That's one problem with scuba diving. You don't really know what dangers you're up against until you're deep into them. Chapter 2. We're going to stop right here. I hope you liked Chapter 1 of Deep Water. If you'd like to read some more, please feel free to check it out and enjoy the book.